Very good morning to all of you, and welcome to our webinar on comparative world literatures. We are honored to have Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, as the chairperson of today's webinar. Welcome, ma'am. And it is our great pleasure to have our distinguished and esteemed speakers, Dr. Shibani Phukan, ma'am, and Dr. Dhurjjati Sharma, sir. Welcome to both of you. We regret to inform you that one of our esteemed speakers, Professor Vijayan Sharma, is unfortunately unwell and will not be able to join us today. We wish him a speedy recovery. So now, before we begin, I would like to say that today we will explore the rich diversity of world literatures where our esteemed speakers will share their insights, expertise, and perspectives on this fascinating topic. And now, I must say, it is my great honor to introduce the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, West Bengal, Professor Nandini Sahu, who is a renowned academician, poet, creative writer. And with an illustrious academic background, she previously headed the School of Foreign Languages at IGNOU, Delhi. A prolific author of 23 books, she is a best-selling author on Amazon. Her academic achievements include double gold medals in both graduation and post-graduation, as well as the prestigious Literary Award Gold Medal from the Vice President of India for her outstanding contributions to English studies. She has recently been honored with the Michael Madhusudan Academy Award and Lifetime Achievement Award in the year 2024. And her latest publication, Medusa, is a testament to her literary prowess. Her research expertise encompasses new literatures, critical theory, folklore, and more, cementing her reputation as a leading authority in Indian English literature and education. Now, I would request Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, for the inaugural speech. Ma'am, please.
Good morning, everyone. Namaskar. I'm extremely glad to welcome two young scholars from Northeast India who have been working in Delhi and many places in the country, Dr. Dhurjjati and Shivani Phukan. I have long association with both of them. When I designed this MA program in Folklore and Culture Studies for IGNOU, my my university where I originally belonged to. Dr. Dhurjjati substantially contributed through chapters and through editing of courses. I remember that he has edited one complete course flawlessly, seamlessly. You can't even find a dot here and there when he does the editing work. The academic editing, the content editing, the language editing, and also discussing with me every now and then if there is any change, anything required. And also he has written chapters for that MA in folk literature. And after that, whenever I conceive something on folk literature, I want to offer a program or a course, or I do a research on folk literature. Uh, he is kind of my go-to person. I talk to him, I discuss with him. I don't consider that he is a youngster, so I need not discuss with him. And is very humble and very polite to to share his expertise with me and everybody. And very recently I was his guest. He was my host in Northeast India, where he introduced me to a group of very vibrant people who are actually doing field study and good work. They are doing some tangible work for Northeast India, and he took me out on an academic procession of 2 hours. So I have that kind of association with him. I trust him, so he invited and I went. So this is my personal feeling for Dr. Dhurjjati. And academically he is sound. He has been publishing all over the world, and now also he is critically engaged with some research in Bangalore. He's doing good work, and he's recognized for the work that he has been doing. And I'm very glad that he accepted our invitation, and he's a part of this Hindi University lecture series. And coming to Shivani, she's working for her PhD with me, and then she's working on Northeast Indian literature. And then she is a very senior academic from Delhi University. She's an associate professor, and she has been doing good work. The progress of her PhD is as good as her continuous publications that she is doing in many journals. Recently, I saw some of her good publications in some journals, and she is a very good human being, very helping. She helps all her colleagues that I can see whenever there is any need for them. And I have been talking to her about many projects on Northeastern Indian literature, which she can actually do immediately after she submits her PhD thesis. And she's a very popular teacher in Delhi University. If you go to her social media page, you'll see how her students actually adore her. So I can understand that the way she is a good researcher, a good academician, she's equally a good teacher, and she has been substantially contributing to Delhi University as well, and of course to IGNOU as a PhD scholar of IGNOU. And multiple times we have discussed on many social issues like gender issues, discourses, women's issues, and many others. So whenever she meets me, the range and the variety of things that we discuss are actually very interesting, and she's one person who you can trust with any work. So I'm glad that Shibani and Dr. Dhurjjati have become a part of the Hindi University lecture series, which we introduced in the month of January. And let me tell you that both of you are, I think, 35th and 36th speakers. In 5 months, we have already had 35, 36 speakers and very eminent scholars from the country and outside, from USA, from Germany, from Netherlands. We had speakers from many places. Day before yesterday, we had a very good lecture. I have already put that on the YouTube, and even today's lecture will be there in the YouTube. And I'm very glad to inform you that many universities are informing me. They are sending me messages that they want to use our Hindi University lecture series as a part of their teaching, their classroom. So they have contacted me. I said, yeah, it has to be very formal. Send me a letter, because we need to take some formalities like signing some agreement, kind of things. And they plan to use Hindi University lecture series on comparative world literature as a part of their teaching, and many universities, including from Delhi. So probably when you are delivering this lecture, you are going to be a part of history. Your lectures will be used by very many classrooms. With that, from today's lecture, what are our expectations? Let me just put them. I'm not the expert of Northeastern literature, particularly, though I have been working on folk literature and comparative literature. So I have read a bit of Northeastern literature, but from today's lecture, both the speakers, you belong to the Northeast India, and the first two speakers from Northeast India, no one has spoken from Northeastern perspective till date. So we're glad that you are going to cover that. And from today's lecture, what expectations we have is, the global literary marketplace, placing Northeast literature in that pedagogy. And Northeastern Indian literature, it is, somehow, connected with kind of marginal literature most of the times, though you have to decide if it is still marginal literature or it has become the mainstream, given the situation that many universities, including IGNOU and even JNU has a Center for Northeast Studies. So is it still marginal literature, or it is a part of the mainstream literature? I would like both of you to talk about that rather than me talking about that. But despite the richness of Northeastern literature, they are frequently excluded from world literature syllabi. When it comes to Indian writing in English, or Indian literature in English translation, or comparative literature, Northeastern literature is considered. But when it is world literature, mostly Northeastern literature is excluded, as they do not belong to the quote unquote mainland literatures. That's what many scholars believe. We have to break that perception. And the challenges that the cosmopolitan ideals of the world literature pedagogy face, they claim to be inclusive and representative, but are they actually so? That you have to talk in your lectures today. That's what I expect. And then, the translation as an epistemic violence and a possibility in the Northeastern literary pedagogy. How much of translation is possible, and how much of translation has been done from the northeastern literatures, not just from Assam but from all other northeastern states. How much literature has been translated, and how much the pedagogy of translation engaged with the politics of northeastern social and economic and other such setups. So we expect you to give us some ideas on that kind of northeastern studies. And then the other point that I would expect both of you to enlighten us would be the body, the insurgency, and the post-colonial nation states vis-a-vis northeastern literatures. And then orality and written literatures from Northeast India. Dr. Dhurjjati is a folklorist. So probably you can little bit inform us about orality and the written literature, the oral written continuum. Is there any politics or body politic vis-a-vis the orality and the written literatures of Northeastern India? And how do you deconstruct the textual hierarchies when it comes to oral, tribal, and folklore literatures and the written literatures of Northeastern India? Probably any one of you can consider to give us some information on those. And then reconceptualizing no reconcept I would like you to conceptualize reconceptualize world literatures from the northeastern hinterland, northeastern point of view, and the cosmologies of northeastern literature, uh, northeastern literatures as belonging to a relational world. So these are some very, very critical points, like border in indigenous solidarities, and then the mystic cartographies, and then folklore and mythical folk and mythology in northeastern India. How we put them as a part of our mainstream world literatures, or how can we use them as a part of our mainstream world literature? So these are the questions in my mind on northeastern literature when I think about introducing a department of comparative world literatures in my university. So I told Dr. Baramita that let's find three good speakers from northeastern India. That's how we got in touch with the three of you, to get our ideas clear about how to take one block or one course or a few blocks on northeastern literature, as a northeastern Indian literature, as a part of comparative world literature. So this is our basic idea and expectation from you today. I am more than sure that both of you are going to do justice to your presentations, your lectures. You both are very, very thorough researchers. I have seen the work, the writings of both of you. So with that kind of excitement and enthusiasm in our mind, we welcome Dr. Shibani and Dr. Dhurjjati to the Hindi University Special Lecture Series. Now, Paramita, please.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, we would like to invite, and I'm really delighted to introduce our first speaker and eminent speaker, Dr. Shivani Phukan, ma'am, who is an associate professor in the Department of English at ARST College, University of Delhi. Her research interests include literature from Northeast India, women's writing, and translation studies. She has published poems, articles, and book chapters in prominent national and international journals, and books such as Wasafiri and the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. Additionally, she writes book reviews for publications like Scroll and Livewire The Wire. She has presented research papers at international, national, and UGC sponsored conferences and delivered lectures at workshops and refresher programs for faculty members. Now, I would request Professor Shivani Phukan ma'am for her very interesting lecture. Ma'am, please.
Thank you very much, Paramita. First of all, a very good morning to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Ma'am Nandini Sahu. Dhurjjati, it's a pleasure to be on the same panel as you are. As Professor Sahu has mentioned, the sheer amount of good work that you are doing makes me both proud, as well as it's a motivating factor for somebody who's rather sluggish about working so prolifically to sort of work harder. So it's great. I will, Professor Sahu gave an excellent opening statement about today's lecture, and I hope we are able to, fulfill some of the expectations that she has raised. I was hoping that Professor Dijan Sharma, who was supposed to be here and possibly talk more about comparative literature and world literature, would have, given the introductory lecture, and that would have paved the way for my lecture. But I think there have been sufficient lectures in the series which have talked about, comparative literature and world literature. So I think my takeoff point, although it works with the assumption that you're already familiar with the basic framework of comparative literature and world literature. I think I will not be sort of, I think those who are listening to this lecture will not find it very difficult to place what I have to say within the larger framework, as you are already, quite familiar with some of the issues that the topic throws up. Um, my lecture is primarily going to be focused on literature from the Northeast and how do you use the comparative model to study literature from the Northeast. I will mostly be reading out from certain points that I have put together, but since Professor Sahu talked about positioning Northeast literature in the framework of world literature, right towards the end, possibly in a more extempore manner, I will do my little bit to do that as well. I'm sure there will be other possibilities of further expanding, because it's a huge the kind of possibilities that Professor Sahu threw up. Those are huge possibilities, and the area is indeed very vast. And I think it would need not just a couple of lectures, but many lectures to cover that. Having said that, let me make some points which I hope, if nothing else, would provide us with an introduction to Northeast literature with the point of view, or with the entry point of comparative literature, and which would then further enable us to interject Northeast literature into the bigger, wider platform of world literature. Susan Bassnett writes that the term comparative literature was first introduced in 1816 in France, but it was in the 19th century that the earliest English usage of the term comparative literatures can be found, attributed to its use by Matthew Arnold in 1848. But most theorists agree this distinct method of studying literature saw widespread development only with the establishment of comparative literature departments in universities, where lectures, discussions, and debates evolved and encouraged such a model of study. Traditionally, comparative literature is known as the study of two or more literatures along with their multidimensional components, which may encompass aspects such as historical, economic, cultural, social, philosophical, linguistic factors of the cultures being analyzed. The two literatures could be available in two different languages, but not necessarily so. For example, a comparative literature study is possible between Australian and Canadian literature, though both are literatures written in the English language. CL, or comparative literature, can also be seen as a methodology that is largely interdisciplinary in nature, as the context of the literatures being compared also becomes a vital area of study for the comparison to be truly fruitful, to be a truly fruitful endeavor. In many ways, the growth of comparative literature, of the comparative literature model, can be posited against the tendency to read literature in terms of national literatures. While the latter examines commonalities in the literature of a nation in terms of its development, themes explored, popular genres and styles adopted, and thus makes a case for its shared characteristics as indicative of it being representative of a nation and its interests, comparative literature makes a case for analyzing commonalities by transcending the boundaries and borders of nations and political barriers. It is interesting to note and make a comparison here and do a study perhaps about how both these literatures evolve. Theorists such as Edward Said have eloquently and persuasively argued in Culture and Imperialism that the rise of colonialism led to the growth of national literatures. But it is after the departure of colonial rule that one witnesses the rise of national literatures in post-colonial countries such as India. a tendency catalyzed by the need to affirm a great tradition, does instill pride in all things Indian and to put forth an argument for a cohesive, united in diversity India. The trajectory of growth of these two kinds of national literatures, one furthering the agenda of colonialism and the other rising out of the embers of the end of colonialism, would serve as an interesting and important comparative study. The comparative literature model of study thus can be seen as a critical methodology to examine literatures beyond its assumed scope of study. Ejaz Ahmed, in his path-breaking work in theory, had put forward certain significant suggestions towards defining what comprises Indian literature. Ahmed had observed that a comparative study between the regional literatures of the nation could be one significant intervention in that direction. However, given the paucity of knowledge that still prevails about literature from the Northeast, this talk proposes to focus on the possibility of using the comparative literature model to study literature from the Northeast of India, and thus posit it as an enabling approach to examine and understand literature from the Northeast, and then place it in the larger context of modern Indian literature. In order to do so, I will begin by briefly familiarizing you with a historical overview of the Northeast and how each state came into being. The reason for doing so is to familiarize you with the fact that whether it be the Northeast's encounter with colonialism or the fraught relationship that most states belonging to the region have with the nation state, there is much that is common between the states that comprise the Northeast. And at the same time, such an overview will also provide us with a glimpse of how, while there are similarities, there are marked differences between them, the issues that each state and its people grapple with, and does influence the literature being written. The talk will then focus on the growth of modern Indian literature in the Northeast, with colonial modernity playing the role of a catalyst in not only modernizing the literature of the region, but in ushering in the written script of certain languages belonging to the Northeast. Further, a comparative study will be done focusing on the thematic similarities and differences of literatures from the Northeast. In doing so, the role of translations, especially of that from a regional language to English, and its consequent impact on the region's literature will be examined, once again using a comparative model. Finally, the talk will visit the possibility of establishing a comparative model of study to examine literature from the Northeast against modern Indian literature, with the intention that such a possibility would not only pave the way for solidly affirming the place of Northeast literature within the broader framework of modern Indian literature, but also facilitate a forging of understanding and ties beyond literature between the Northeast and the mainland. Having laid out what my paper, what my lecture seeks to do, I would just want to add a couple of things that I would also then towards the end look at positioning how the Northeast literature could perhaps be read in terms of its could claim its place of belonging in world literature as well. Although I will not be going into great details at this point of time. Also, I would want to point out, because I think the introductory remarks did talk about the presence of Northeast literature in Indian universities. I recently actually did some study on that, and surprisingly, while the Northeast continues to sort of be popular in terms of academic engagement, or or in terms of literary festivals focusing on the Northeast, when it comes to universities actually offering a course or a paper on Northeast literature, I think there is much that needs to be done. There are actually very few universities which offer complete papers on the Northeast. For example, there is Mizoram University which does that, and and there are of course other, I'm forgetting names here, of universities, which I think not Nagaland, I'm forgetting which other, Northeast Hill University, of course, offers a paper on Northeast literature. Sikkim University does that. But apart from that, even universities such as the one that I belong to offer, just possibly the reading of one poet or one short story from the Northeast in a paper on Indian literature. And now, for example, I can speak about Delhi University in confidently, because I know that syllabus in some detail, which might not be the case for all other universities, that we offer several papers on Indian literature, and yet literature from the Northeast continues to be marginalized. So, and therefore, I'm hoping that what I will try and sort of posit through my lecture is that we need to make a greater claim in terms of belonging to Indian literature, modern Indian literature in the very first place, and then sort of, work towards larger goals. The northeast of India is home to 7 states, Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Mizoram, Meghalaya, Nagaland, Tripura, along with Sikkim, a region that stretches from the foothills of the Himalayas to the tip of the Malaysian peninsula. As Preeti Gill writes, the term Northeast India, a directional place name, entered the Indian lexicon in 1971, more as an administrative concept than a local point of view. For example, those of us who belong to the Northeast rarely actually refer to ourselves, as belonging to the Northeast. We would say, I'm from Assam, I'm from Dibrugarh in Assam, Jorhat in Assam, okay, or, I'm from Manipur and I'm from Imphal or wherever, but rarely actually as belonging to the Northeast. The modern period in the history of the Northeast is marked by the beginning of British rule in Assam following the First Anglo-Burmese War fought between 1824-1826. Dr. Priyam Goswami observes in the history of Assam that the signing of the Treaty of Yandabo marked the beginning of British colonial penetration into Northeast India. Assam becomes a constituent state of India in 1947 and is connected to the rest of India by a 22-kilometer strip of land referred to popularly as the Chicken's Neck. Arunachal Pradesh is the largest state of this region and gained statehood only in 1987. It was a union territory since 1972 and part of what is known as NEFA, or the Northeast Frontier Agency prior to that. Its geographic importance cannot be overemphasized as it shares its borders with 4 countries. As Samrat Chaudhary observes, Arunachalis are animists and worship nature as God. The Adis, for example, worship Doni Polo or the sun moon god. The state of Manipur merged with India in 1949 as a result of the merger agreement treaty and continued to be a union territory till 1972 when it was recognized as a state. Meghalaya, carved out of the state of Assam in 1972, is home to the Khasi, Jaintia, and Garo tribes named after the hills that run through the state. It is the only state of the Northeast that practices a matrilineal system, and women have a greater freedom to make decisions concerning their lives. Mizoram is another state that shares its boundaries with 2 countries, and it is as late as 1960 that the government of India recognized Nagaland as a full-fledged state within India. Tripura acceded to the Indian Union in 1949 and was initially a union territory, but gained statehood in 1972. The Debabarman community forms a large part of the Tripuris, who are the largest tribal community of the state. Sikkim is a late entrant into the states that form the Northeast and became a full-fledged state after a popular referendum in 1975. This brief overview provides certain significant information that needs to be pointed out. The foremost among them is that each state enters into a union with the Indian nation at different points of time, and that union is at times fraught with anxieties, great reluctance, and even some amount of coercion. The history of the states of Northeast also reveals that Assam historically has always had closer ties with the rest of the country, was actively involved in the freedom movement, was more involved with the policies forged by the leaders of the freedom movement, which in turn has had degrees of impact in the evolution of many of the other states in the Northeast. There exists a certain kinship of history between Manipur and Tripura, owing to the fact that both states witnessed a troubled progression from being princely states to democracies, a path that is crisscrossed by several clashes and rebellions. States such as Nagaland, in fact, declared their independence a day before India's Declaration of Independence, and this resolve for independence led to decades of armed insurgency and violent reprisals by the Indian state. Mizoram had a checkered history not only with the Indian state but with Assam, of which it was a part. These tensions were only exacerbated by the Mautam or famine of 1959 and the rise of the Mizo National Front, which in fact demanded independence from India in a memorandum submitted in 1965 by its president Lal Denga. And subsequently, this led to an armed struggle between the MNF and the Indian armed forces, which again lasted for many years. In many of the states, such as Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh, what needs to be pointed out is that there were repeated attempts at a contrived cohesion that simply ignored the reality of diversities of tribes and ethnicities, wherein two neighboring tribes lived in such isolation from each other that they could neither communicate nor understand each other's language. But this history of hostility and infighting amidst clans, tribes, neighboring regions, and states, along with a constant sense of threat of invaders in older times, ranging from the Burmese, the Mughals, and the British, also ironically suggests a sense of fragile shared history amongst these states that comprise the Northeast. The history of neglect, perceived or otherwise by the states of the Northeast, the reduction of the Northeast to its frontier status and thus its importance being acknowledged only in terms of protecting the safety and sovereignty of the Indian state, the repeated stereotyping of its people, constant presence of violence, insurgencies, all of these issues do lead to a sense of shared history, a sense that is then further heightened when one examines the literature of the Northeast. While reading and analyzing any literature from a region as varied as the Northeast in terms of commonalities is fraught with homogenizing tendencies and problems that does arise, it does have strategic usefulness. Tilottama Mishra writes that a collection of writings which represents a wide variety of cultures, nationalities, and languages cannot be compiled based on similarity of style or content, but it isn't completely avoidable. Once the dangers of homogenizing are understood, a strategic attempt at looking at common themes and preoccupations of literature from the Northeast is an enabling and fruitful one to understand and analyze literature from the region. A dominant theme of literature from the Northeast is the tendency towards literary historiography. While the importance of the theme in addressing the gaps and silences in mainstream Indian history cannot be overemphasized, the focus on historical events in such literature, such as the impact of British colonialism on the Northeast or the resistance offered to colonialism, also has meaningful consequences. But even as one does so, one notes that while a range of works from Indira Goswami's The Bronze Sword of Tengpakri Tehsildar, Mamang Dai's Black Hill, Isterin Kire's Bitter Wormwood, Malsomi Jacob's Zorami, and so on are examples of such an initiative, it is a tendency which is perhaps less pronounced in the literature from Assam. The reasons for the same could possibly lie in the further marginalization and silencing that the states besides Assam have been subjected to. For example, Lasit Phukan, even if it is as a footnote, still makes his way into history books taught in schools, but the Battle of Konoma, for example, does not. But this necessity for literary historiographies perhaps also explains why the novel as a genre seems to be the favored one, followed perhaps by poetry. Even when one studies the impact of British colonialism on the Northeast, one discovers its prevalence as well as resistance towards it wasn't necessarily similar. Another predominant theme is, of course, the presence of violence that is addressed by the literature from the Northeast. But the context of violence often varies from state to state, and only a comparative analysis that examines the specificities would result in a meaningful engagement with Northeast literature. It would also be instructive to analyze how sometimes, in fact, it is the animosities between the states that comprise the Northeast that become the trigger for violence, or communities within the state itself. What we are witnessing in Manipur right now, the conflict between Kukis, Zos, and Meithis is a case in point. Assam also has seen such violence in the past between the Assamese and the Bodo community. Deeply relevant to much of the violence that the Northeast witnessed and continues to do so is the rise of ethno-nationalism in many parts of the Northeast. The understanding of the same is contingent upon one's understanding of how issues of ethnicity intersect with caste, gender, religion to complicate relationships, but with language and religion playing a greater divisive role in Assam, ethnic differences play a greater role in states such as Manipur or Meghalaya. In many ways, ethno-nationalism is echoed in many ways in the literature of the Northeast, at times valorized, but increasingly critiqued for its celebration of a muscular, chauvinistic patriotism. This criticism is often from a gendered perspective, and therefore a comparative study of writings by, especially by women writers from the Northeast, would offer a noteworthy perspective. Literature from the Northeast, perhaps owing to the geography of the region, inevitably and intrinsically reflect concerns for the environment in its literature. With the increasing interest that literature has shown in environmental issues, a fact well illustrated by the rise of the Anthropocene, the climate fiction, and the popularity of works of writers such as Amitav Ghosh, much of Northeast literature can be studied and understood within such a framework. Writings by Istirin Kire, Anuradha Sharma Pujari, Kinkam Singh Nongri, and several others critically examine man's relationship with the environment in a region where a symbiotic relationship is essential for survival of both man and the natural world he or she inhabits. These are some of the thematic concerns that could be examined through the comparative literature model to better understand literature from this region, and perhaps to conclude for ourselves if there is indeed a literature that could be studied under the umbrella category of Northeast literature. The relationship between comparative literature and translation is an intimate one, because it is mostly in translation that we are able to read a literature in a language that is unknown to us or we aren't functional in. This is true to some extent for literature from the Northeast as well, as translation plays a significant role in making available literature from one language of the Northeast to another that we can read and understand. In fact, translations played a critical role in the growth of modern literature of Northeast. In Assam, translation as an activity engaged by saints and scholars predates to medieval times and the then growing influence of Vaishnavism in the region because of the Bhakti movement. Sanskrit texts, primarily those seen as philosophical, such as the Bhagavad Gita, along with religious texts such as the Ramayana, were translated into local languages. I'm sure Dhurjjati will be speaking much more in detail about these. But translation as an activity gains momentum only as a consequence of British colonialism. The Serampore Mission Press, a book and newspaper publisher, was set up in January 1800 with the mandate to publish translations of the Bible in 25 Indian languages. A Bengali translation of the Gospel of Matthew was published in the month of August 1800. Once this press closed on account of running into debts, a similar mission was subsequently The mission was transferred onto the shoulders of the Baptist Mission Press, set up in Calcutta and subsequently in Sibsagar in Assam in 1843. Along with the translation and publication of Bible, books and journals were published and brought about a standardization of the Assamese language. This process of standardization was further strengthened by the concerted efforts of the Assamese intelligentsia um, um, to resist the British attempt to impose Bengali in Assam as the official language. The translation of the Bible not only resulted in the modernization of the Assamese language, but paved the way for other translations from English to Assamese, which resulted in the growth of the Assamese novel and the exploration of more contemporary themes and narrative strategies by those writing in Assamese. The unfortunate fallout of this standardization was, of course, a very regrettable effacement of the polyglot linguistic culture of a people where many other languages and dialects besides Assamese were and continue to be prevalent. As Tilottama Mishra observes, colonialism superimposed a Eurocentric concept of modernity derived from the Enlightenment on the literatures of the region, thereby creating a rupture between the past and the present. But the consequences of the translation of the Bible had much greater impact on languages and literature from the other states of the Northeast. As one proceeds to discuss this, one perhaps also ought to remember that many of these states that now comprise the Northeast were carved out of Assam post-independence. It also needs to be reiterated that other parts of the Northeast are marked by even greater tribal, ethnic, and linguistic diversities. This is important to take note of because given the small population that comprises most tribes, dialects were, and to date, continue to be the norm, a written script coming into existence, if at all, only as a consequence of the imperative to translate the Bible to as many languages as possible to maximize its reach and thus, of course, further the civilizing mission of British imperialism. Now, what happens as a consequence of this is something that Pauthang Haukip talks about when he talks about languages in Manipur. He says that on the basis of the genetic relationships, the languages of Manipur may be broadly be divided into two groups, the Kukichin group and the Naga group. The Kukichin group comprises various tribes with various linguistic aspirations, and therefore, as Haukip observes, the translation of the Bible into various dialects only succeeded in dividing the tribes further. This is again seen if you look at the literature of Mizoram, because while the Mizos did get their present Roman script in the year 1894, due to the efforts of two English pioneer missionaries who translated the Bible, but it also led to the natural death of many dialects. I'm fast forwarding a little bit. Now, and you see how this language issue plays out, for example, even in states such as Arunachal Pradesh, okay, where, you have more than 25 tribes and 100 sub-tribes with as many languages in use. Now, what the translation of the Bible did was that it was translated into the language belonging to the Ao Nagas, but Assamese was widely spoken and also used as a medium of literature. But all of these differences between the tribes, the languages that they spoke, were effaced once, the translation of the Bible happened and a certain language became more dominant and the dialects continued to die. And I think we have many languages, many dialects which are no longer in usage because of that now. Ultimately, what one notes is that while the translation of the Bible ushered in a written script in some languages or modernized others, it ultimately negatively impacted especially those literatures which did not already have a strong written presence. This not only resulted in uneven development of language and literature in various states of the Northeast, but ironically, as critics have pointed out, created a situation where one might be able to read your own literature only in English. The combined impact of the strengthening of the written over the oral and the growth of English in many states of the Northeast also had other significant consequences. The oral tradition has been an integral aspect of the lives and cultures of most parts of the Northeast. The oral tradition, but with the growth of print capitalism ushered in by colonial rule, a rich oral tradition of literature faced the danger of being eroded and forgotten. Moreover, with much of literature available in dialects, the danger of effacement of such literature is a real one. With a significant amount of literature out of the pale of what is traditionally understood and accepted as literature, a comparative approach becomes tenuous. Further, the uneven translations from one language of the Northeast to another or to English further creates a hierarchy of literatures. In the resulting absence of a level playing field, a comparative mode becomes challenging, but because of that challenge, perhaps even more significant and more needed. But despite these hurdles, comparative literature can provide an enabling framework for literature from the Northeast to be studied and analyzed in a meaningful manner. The objective of CL has perhaps always gone beyond its immediate mandate of a study restricted to literary criticism, but also to foster meaningful engagement between two cultures and its people. The analysis of literature from Northeast, despite certain roadblocks, reveals certain significant strands. Predominant among them would perhaps be an undeniable post-coloniality that marks literature from the Northeast. It is a post-coloniality that not only continuously interrogates British colonialism, but even more significantly raises questions about the nation state, citizenship, and belonging. Much of literature from the Northeast offers a subaltern view of history from a marginalized, gendered point of view. In doing so, it therefore also offers a narrative that resists dominant, hegemonic narratives of the Northeast and issues that concerns them. Given the close proximity with nature in which most from the Northeast share, the Anthropocene and emerging perspective through which literature is increasingly being viewed is an inevitable one for Northeast literature. Just these few name features of literature from the Northeast is enough to indicate that these thematic concerns also find resonance in modern Indian literatures, and thus heighten the possibility of reading literature from the Northeast in tandem and with a comparative framework from other Indian states, or what is usually counted as modern Indian literature. Such a comparative study would, in the final analysis, not only affirm the position of literature from the Northeast as firmly belonging to the larger category of modern Indian literature, but also thus create ties of history, among other things, between people from the Northeast and those that belong to the mainland. In fact, a comparative study is possible even if we were to examine classical literature, for example, the growth of the Ramayana, something that again I'm sure Dhurjjati is going to touch upon, which could again provide a kind of an a comparative study between literature from the Northeast and that of what is known as mainland India. And such studies would perhaps pave the way for literature from the Northeast to be not only be an important and integral part of modern Indian literature, but also to be seen as post-colonial in its nature, and and also pave the way for literature from the Northeast not only to be studied vis-a-vis world literature through the prism of post-coloniality, but I did speak about the presence of violence, for example, in literature from the Northeast. Now, the world that we live in is increasingly a world that is living in a period of conflict. Okay, and again, I think conflict literature, the resultant trauma that results from conflict, I think both conflict literature, memory studies, studies of trauma that are being done worldwide. I think all of that could be done through the prism of Northeast literature, or Northeast literature could be studied in this larger framework also of memory studies, of trauma studies. And while in the context of India, for example, one could look at a comparative study between conflict literature and trauma studies, between say from Assamese literature and Kashmiri literature. A similar kind of study is also possible with, say, from literature emerging out of other conflict areas in the world. With that, I would like to end my lecture and and listen to what Dhurjjati has to further say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for such an enlightening lecture. As a few of our lovely participants actually has raised their hands, so I would like to say that we will be able to take only one question at the end of the lecture, and along with that, we will share our email address in the chat box. So feel free to send your questions to us, and we would love to forward it to our speakers. Thank you. And now I would request Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am for her very important remarks.
Okay, Paramita, if they have questions, probably we can take a few of the questions. How many of them are there? 3 to 4?
No, actually, ma'am, as we have kept them as a participants, we have to let them as contributor first, then they will be able to ask. So I thought.
Okay, fine, fine. Shivani, the your lecture definitely was it was a meaningful engagement. I am quoting you. It was, and you talked about the importance of translation. Yes, I am glad you did. From your lecture, some takeaway for our scholars and our students. I have jotted down a few points which I'll ask them to discuss with you at a later stage. Congratulations for this very interesting and very engaging research, Shivani. So you talked about the epistemic limits of world literature and how the texts demand an interdisciplinary reading. Northeastern literate. You started with that, blending ethnography, political history, ecology, and oral traditions. That was your key point. And then you questioned Northeastern literature. Can it be national literature, or an internal colonial literature, or it can be a part of post-colonial literature? That was a tension that you kept on bringing forth and then taking it back several times, and that is important. We must have some food for thought after your lecture, and you successfully did that. And then you talked about framing Northwestern literature as a part of the Indian national canon, which often executes Hindi English binaries and the majoritarian aesthetics. You questioned that. And also the role of Assam in the freedom struggle, and again its subsequent and consequent role in the creation of Northeastern literature was something that was one of your thrust areas, and I think I'm going to read a bit more about that after your lecture. And then also your question was about Northeastern literature from a sub-national to transnational literary voice, the tribal voices as global resonance in a Northeastern cosmopolitan setup. You had some points about that. And then you talked about kinship, literary solidarity, and the resistance to homogenization. We create a homogenic when it is Northwest literature. We don't think about all the states separately. We talk about a homogenic literature. Almost every scholar does it, except good scholars from Northeastern India. Rest of the country, or maybe rest of the world, when it is Northeastern literature, they talk about one particular tone or one particular thrust area, or the problems, the tensions. They don't try to divide one from the other. When it is Eastern Indian literature, we never combine literature from West Bengal with literature from Odisha. We call Bengali literature, we call Odia literature, and then we call Odia literature in translation or Bengali literature in translation. All literature from Kerala, from Tamil Nadu, from Karnataka, we talk about those. But about literature from the Northeast, people hardly think about the divergent points, the possible divergent points, which you really pointed out, and I'm glad you did it. So your questions on kinship, literary solidarity, and the resistance to homogenization was something related to marginalization. Memory studies, yes, you talked about memory studies, about blue cultural studies, about green studies, and then the idea of belonging, and then a literary union of the nations vis-a-vis northeastern literature, and then your conclusion was about a decolonial historiography of northeastern literature. You told so many points. Of course, I'm not going to repeat all of them, but things that I really liked, or maybe I'm going to read a bit more about them. I'm just pointing out those. So you gave a strategic historiography that we must follow, and the gaze of the metropolitan scholarship should be questioned. And then your paper concluded by giving us a call for transdisciplinary methodology that centers indigenous critical theories, and then it talked about the tribal narratives, and rethinking northeastern literature itself was something that you pointed out. And I think the scholars and people who are listening to you will be hugely benefited by your paper. And whatever questions Paramita is getting for you, she will email all of those to you. But at the end of the lecture, after Dr. Dhurjjati has spoken, we will try to take one or two questions. With this, I pass it on to Paramita to introduce Dhurjjati formally, and then we are looking forward to listening to Dhurjjati. Congratulations, Shivani, once again.
Thank you, ma'am. And now I am really pleased to introduce our next speaker, an outstanding speaker, Dr. Dhurjjati Sharma, who is an assistant professor at Assam's Guwahati University, Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies. He was educated at the University of Delhi and the English and Foreign Languages University, Shillong. With a background in editing and research, he has published articles and book reviews in esteemed journals and contributed chapters to books published by Orient Black Swan, Springer Nature, and Routledge. He translates between Assamese, English, and Hindi and has worked on notable projects, including translating G. N. Devi's Mahabharata, the Epic and the Nation, and the Hindi translation of the PLSI Assam volume. Now, I would request Dr. Dhurjjati Sharma sir for his lecture. Please, sir.
Thank you so much, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am, and the entire academic and administrative fraternity of Hindi University, including Dr. Paramita Das, for this wonderful opportunity to share my bits, my thoughts on the subject of comparative world literature. And I'll be sharing my screen, just by sharing it. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes, but as it happens, when the screen is visible, I can't seem to see anything on the Google Meet screen. So, right. So kindly prompt me if sort of I lose contact or something happens. Just let me know, because I am only seeing the PowerPoint right in front of me. So I don't see anything else. So just let me know if something occurs, so that I know that I'm not being audible or you cannot hear me.
Sure.
It's right. So this is the title that I have given to my presentation, Comparative World Literature in True Literary History and Translation, a few perspectives from Northeast India. So in the course of my presentation, I will be talking about comparative world literature through twin perspectives. One is literary history and translation. And I'll try to contextualize my discussion within Northeast India, but I feel that only limiting myself to Northeast India may not do justice to the emerging discipline of CWL. So towards the second part of my lecture, I would also talk about how a study of Indian literature as such could also enable developing newer perspectives on comparative world literature, and how studying Indian literary perspectives could also help us in turn to think about the Northeast. So I see this more as a continuous process and how one can help the other. So this is how I would like to structure my presentation. So I begin with, can you see the slides moving? Is it visible? Can you see the first slide?
Yes,
Uh,
Dhurjyati, we can see.
right,
Yes, yes,
thank
it's
you.
visible.
Okay, okay, right. So I begin with some observations on how Indian literature as a category has been studied, because I begin with this engagement with how Indian literature, with its multiplicity and its integrative character, could enable, could itself posit itself as a category, as a model for studying world literatures. So when we talk about Indian literature, we see a constant interplay between an integrative sense of Indianness and a strong sense of regional identity inherent within the vernacular literary traditions. We see this process in its simultaneity. So I'm quoting here from Bhalchandra Nemare. He says that, and I'm quoting him, that we could say that India is an area of comparative literature, a geographical area where more than 105 geolinguistic units exist and at least 50 languages have written mode of expression, and literature written in each of these languages has a distinct regional character, unquote. He further states, if we believe that the Indian literature is an organism or a polysystem, we cannot afford to ignore its plurality, its distinct varieties, its long chain of dialects, one merging into the neighboring variety to the ends of the country, unquote. So Neymar here is re-emphasizing the very ideas of participation and augmentation. These are two vital keywords, participation and augmentation, that go into the construction of the category of Indian literature. So we can sort of posit this hypothesis at the outset that Indian literature by nature therefore is comparative, and the manner of studying its regional components would serve to posit new frameworks for the study of global literatures. The domain of Indian literature, therefore, in particular, its medieval variety, also other varieties, but particularly if we take the medieval variety into question, provides exactly the same opportunity to understand multilinguality and multiculturality, which are like the buzzwords of the contemporary global era in real practical sense of the terms. So in this regard, Ajaz Ahmed, in his book In Theory, particularly in his essay in a chapter on the notes towards the definition of the category of Indian literature, he rightly observes that multilinguality and polyglot fluidity seem to have been the chief characteristics, possibly the characteristics, which give Indian literature its high degree of unification in its pre-modern phase, unquote. He further noted that mass literary cultures remained polyglot well into the 19th century, when the insertion of print capitalism, modern forms of unilingual vernacular education, etc., and the rise of many regional and religious particularisms speeded up the process of linguistic differentiation. Dr. Shibani Phukan has already touched upon some of these aspects through her discussion vis-a-vis the literary cultures of Northeast India, the role of English in this regard. So therefore, if this proposed hypothetical Indian model, about which I'll be talking about, of studying world literature has to carve a distinct niche for itself, it should focus on drawing global attention towards the manner in which languages and literatures in the pre-colonial or the pre-modern period interacted upon grounds of reciprocal influence and reception. But obviously, there are problems. There's undoubtedly a slippery and uncertain terrain beset with what Ahmed says as confusions and inadequacies of reliable information as to texts, authors, genres, modes of transmission, audiences, and so on, unquote. Nevertheless, the effort is rewarding, not only for the light such studies would shed on the so-called dark periods of history, but also help unearth a new vision of Indianness, one that would be different from the one fed and nurtured by the Orientalists and the Indologists, one that would instead be based on the vernacular literary traditions of India. So here, as I shall try to explore in the second part of my lecture when I'll be talking about translation, we need to understand the mediatory role of English, how English in the colonial as well as the post-colonial period has been uh, subjected to multiple articulations. I shall give examples when I discuss this in the later part of my lecture. So now coming to Northeast India, so when visualized as a landscape or as a timescape across space and time, Northeast India provides a unique window to a multitude of literary and cultural traditions that often do not fit into the ontoteleological formulations at work in the conceptualization of literary history as a subject of critical academic study. In the Indian context, as we all know, the twin impulses of colonialism and nationalism were instrumentally not only shaping the trajectory of events within the history of literature, but also influencing the production of literature in the first place. So therefore, Northeast, with its own position at the frontiers of both time and space, has been seen as a recipient vis-a-vis this unilateral trajectory of influence from the mainland to periphery, which has in turn led to the prevalence of certain binaries, which we often come across, like mainland periphery, classical folk, cosmopolitan vernacular, or even dominant emergent. Even the very usage of the term Northeast India as beginning as a directional category and then also as an administrative structure could be seen as indicating kind of a paternalistic attitude on the part of the mainland to show the region its place in the grander scheme of the nation. So with this, so the problem, as we all have recognized with this adoption of this ontoteleological model of literary history borrowed from the West, which obviously causes the near exclusion or rather relegation of many personas or events, texts, persons, events happening within the literary histories of communities within the Northeast. Shibani had touched upon some of these from Nagaland and Mizoram, but these are certain things that we need to keep in mind. And also, if we look at the mediums of expression, like whether, vis-a-vis orality and written tradition, we find that there are instances within the Assamese and possibly also within the Manipuri literary cultures, they have a demonstrable written textual tradition. Whereas many other cultures from the Northeast, they do not have a demonstrable, long, sustaining written textual tradition. That's a major problem that one faces when talking about literary history and translation. So in this case, Sheldon Pollock had noted that he had drawn our attention towards this particular, prioritization of writing. He writes that writing makes possible the production of a history of a sort the oral is incapable of producing. So obviously, when when we talk about literary history, what happens? There are judicious selection from the available catalogs or repository of written texts or manuscript, which are sort of canonized. They are placed within the annals of literary history, but many literary works which are not reduced to writing, which are not present in writing, they do not find presence within the canon of literary history. So in this particular context, we need to recognize the pitfalls, the limitations of blindly adhering to the dictates of colonial and nationalist imaginings of literary history, where written was obviously prioritized over the oral. And in this context, we also need to understand the impact of Sanskritization and also Hinduization in determining the nature of literary production, how religion and caste, and also how the very cosmopolitanism of languages and literary cultures led to the prioritization of certain literary forms over others when when the very idea of literary history in Indian languages was conceived. So So obviously in Assamese and Manipuri, there is a veritable written textual tradition. But about other languages of Northeast India, the process is still happening. The process is not yet complete. And obviously there are problems, confusions regarding, finding works which could actually testify or which could actually represent the culture of a particular region within the Northeast. So these are the issues that we need to settle in. That are we what methodological uh, apparatus are we going to devise if we have to focus on studying the oral cultures not only within Northeast but across the country? I mean, this is not a problem pertaining only to the Northeast, but even Orissa, for example. And also maybe there are many oral communities across the country in the central India, in South India. So how to deal with cultures which do not have a demonstrable written textual tradition? It's not that they lacked history. Otherwise, we'll be only rehearsing the colonial model of Indians not having a sense of history. So we need to have a particular model or approach in place to address this problem. Right. So we recognize this ineffectuality of this ontoteleological model of linear narrative history. And we need to recognize the efficacy of the oral performative literary cultures, which often transcended the imagined spatial temporal boundaries of language and community. Because we need to understand when the very idea of region, as I said, when we talk about Indian literature, there is on the one hand, there is this concept of integrative imagination, but on the other hand, is also this imagination of region within the Indian nation. So when we are imagining a nation following the colonial nationalist imagining, there was always selection of certain words, as that this particular text is Assamese but not Bengali. This particular text is Oriya, not Bengal. We know how such tussles were happening in the 19th century, how certain authors, they were they were prevalent, whose works were read across the boundaries. But when the boundaries were drawn between regions, that this is Assam, this is Bengal, this is Orissa, so then they started claiming certain authors as their own. So how, so it's, but if we talk about oral performative genres, they often transcended those regional boundaries. So how to deal with those linguistic literary forms of expression which transcended the politically drawn boundaries? So regarding the unique position of the Northeast within this larger paradigm of nation and narration, Professor K.C. Baral said, and I am quoting him, that contemporary writings from Northeast, either in English or the vernaculars, aspire towards a vision beyond the narrow ethnic groove and represent a shared history. In these writings, the cultural memory is reprocessed in that the intensity of feeling overflows the labor of technique and craft. The evolution of this literature as a domain has its freshness as well as rootedness in age-old traditions and therefore could be situated outside the Marg-Desi dichotomy. So what we observe a sort of local universality, which obviously necessitates the adoption of a more nuanced, more located, more historically positioned approach towards the study of the literary cultures of Northeast India. So now what is there in front of us to look beyond these linguistic dichotomies, possibly, if we take the present context of Northeast India or, in the colonial and the post-colonial period as like English as the new cosmopolitan or Assamese as the dominant vernacular, when Shibani ma'am talked about the very instance of Latin Phukan, right? How Assamese even has its own position within Northeast literary cultures. So we need to move beyond these twin dichotomies and explore the diverse range of linguistic and genre-based choices made by writers across the region. And also, if we talk about languages, many of these languages chosen by these writers for their literary compositions may not come under the category of scheduled languages. We need to keep this thing in mind that, we have 22 scheduled languages. So there are many writers, poets who are writing in languages which are not one of these languages. Now, this is the experience I had while working in this People's Linguistic Survey of India project, where I sort of, it was basically a translation project where I translated write-ups on 50 languages from Assam itself. I'm not talking about other states of the region of Northeast India, but within Assam, there are 50 languages belonging to 3 to 4 language families. But among scheduled languages, we only have a handful. So what about literary works which were, or oral literary forms, literary works, which are composed in these non-scheduled languages? So what about their history? What about their legitimacy within the framework of literary culture within the Northeast or within the country? So each one of these languages, whether scheduled or non-scheduled, it opens a door to new experientialities which are unique to the cultural geography inhabited by the writers. For example, in Nagaland, now there are 16 communities. And none of the languages spoken by those 16 communities come under the scheduled languages category. Now, what about the literature composed in those regions? So a new literary history of Northeast or newer attempts at translation should be focused on giving a renewed emphasis on rediscovering, the sacred geographies or ritual boundaries which characterize the identity of these different cultures within the Northeast or also in the larger Indian, in the larger national framework. So we come across, if we talk about translation, we come across an amazing range of untranslatable particularities. There are certain terms for which we cannot find an equivalent in English or Hindi or Assamese. We cannot. So we need to deal with these issues. And here I'm quoting from Jitubani Basumatari. She rightly points out in the context of the growing literary discourse of the Northeast region. And she writes that it is high time to look at some of the literary works of the region in new light by shifting the focus from the highly political and conflict-ridden content to the day-to-day lived realities of the characters where life rooted in the folk and traditional cultures persists, unquote. So if we can posit two hypotheses before I move to the larger Indian context, I would like to posit two, if you're talking about a very inclusive literary history of Northeast India, here are two imperatives which I feel are necessary. That one is reimagining one space not as a frontier, but rather as an active node within the network of an ever-present interlinked spatio-temporal dynamic, not as a frontier, but more like a crossroad, like a cultural hotspot, literary cultural hotspot. And number two, visualize the role of language as an instrument where communities translate their subjectivities into tangible written forms in the present. To retrospect, therefore, and ponder over the historical role of language, whether oral, written, or even performance. Even performance has its own language. So how much of this can come within this new imagining that we are talking, a new imagination vis-a-vis literary history of Northeast India? So therefore, we need to go beyond the cosmopolitan and the dominant vernacular in the fashioning of the identities and imagination. And I may please inform you that this cosmopolitan and dominant vernacular are terms used by Sheldon Pollock. So I'm basically responding to him when I'm talking about it. So therefore, and again, if we continue with this engagement with language, we'll see that the very fact that the power of language resides not only within the codified symbols uttered or inscribed upon a page, but also extends to the domain of the body, which must be recognized. And here, when Temsola Au, in her poems, she had recognized how the coming of the Bible, right? How they were given a book, which defined their religious beliefs, whereas religion for them existed in different other matters. So how religion became confined to a book. We find this in many poems of Northeast Indian writers. So the idea of the body-centric forms of knowledge, and I'm invoking my teacher, Professor T.S. Satyanarayana, when he talked about the body-centric domain of knowledge. So as I say, the body, therefore, extending from literary history, so even the body could be seen body, as I understand, as the performative, the body in performance, therefore, could be seen as untranslated, untranslatable particularities. And also the primacy of the body is indirectly, yet still partially recognized when the whole issue of endangered languages is brought into discussion. Because when we are talking about endangered languages, what do we see? That, okay, this particular language has 1,000 speakers, or this particular language only has like 100 speakers alive. So the idea of the body of speaker, how many people are still speaking that language, comes into focus. Right. So idea of the body here becomes a very important, and also problematic, because the reduction of the identity of the person to merely a speaker betrays an exclusive emphasis on the codified appearance of a language, because language exists not only as a oral thing, but it also has its presence, in a highly multimedial environment. Here I maybe differ a little with the linguists when talking about these cultural factors. But anyway, this is something that requires to be expanded further. Now, I would like to put forward you some of my observations regarding Indian literature as such, and see if we can use some of these frameworks for studying cultures of the Northeast. So, if we try to, and as I said, I'm looking at literary history and translation as twin perspectives. So I talked about literary history, I'll talk about translation, but I'll be looking at translation on a pan-Indian basis and see if we can use some of these formulations while talking about the Northeast. Now, obviously, I don't need to reiterate the history of translation within modern India. It began obviously with William Jones's translation of Kalidas's Abhigyana Shakuntalam in 1789. But if we try to understand how translation as a process started in India with the coming of colonialism, we'll see that throughout the first half of the 19th century, the texts chosen for translation by Indian or English translators alike belonged mostly to the non-literary domains. I mean, taking aside William Jones's translation, they are mainly in legal, judicial, and religious matters. And here we may invoke Ram Mohan Roy, who was a prolific figure actively engaged in translating chosen Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian texts in English, for drawing the attention of the colonial authorities towards the irrationality of certain absurd and antiquated social practices prevalent within the Indian society of that time. And I give below some of the texts that he had translated from Sanskrit into English, from the Vedanta and the Upanishads, and also from Bangla to English. So they represent his use of translation as a discursive mechanism for an overt, radical reformist agenda for the betterment of the Indian society at that time. And then from Ram Mohan Roy, we move to Michael Madhusudan Datta, where we find in his writings and translation resonances of a new emergent literary cultural ethos within Bengali, and by extension also Indian. Because at that point of time, what was Bengali was also sort of Indian, because that's where the whole process started in the middle decades of the 19th century. So he was instrumental in juxtaposing, in the words of Vinay Dharwalkar, a versatile Indian multilingualism centered on the poetic traditions of pre-modern Bangla, Persian, and Sanskrit, with an astonishing multilingualism in non-Indian languages that ranged over English, Latin, Hebrew, French, and later in life, Greek, German, and Italian, unquote. So in addition to that, he did something, and this is here I would like to draw your attention. This is the process that started from Michael Madhusudan Datta. He did something more crucial, which was initiating a process of Indianizing literary English and applying it as a medium of translation in the very act of writing in its original, and a process that later contributed to the formulation of a genre of Indian English literature. That very idea of vernacularizing English as a, so the very process of translation was embedded within the very act of writing in English. And this is the approach that he followed, in his writings and translation. And as a translator, he had translated Ramnarayan Tarkaratna's play Ratnavali and Dinabandhu's very famous play Neel Darpan into English. So with this spirit of Indianness in writing mediated by a combined sense of being localized and being translated, found new avenues for expression in the fictional writings of Raja Rao and K. Narayan, Mulkha Anand, and G.V. Deshani during the early middle decades of the 20th century. We all know that. Here, the space of the Indian village, a relatively neglected site for literary contextualization, got infused with the wider characteristics of pan-Indianness. It was as if the village ceased to be a peripheral space and it was transformed or translated into a microcosmic site of the emergent sense of Indian nationhood. Here, the influence of Mahatma Gandhi's social spiritual philosophy, which locates the soul of India in the villages, was clearly evident in the writings of these authors, as was his lifelong commitment to revive and restore the pre-colonial state of self-sufficiency within the rural economy. So here, if we take to a bit from read a bit from the from Kantapura, where these are three keywords. If we take Raja Rao's Kantapura, is Gandhi, truth, and ahimsa. And from the foreword by Raja Rao, this is what he says. When I'm, this is the spirit of vernacular English. If we may term it, he says that we are all instinctively bilingual. Many of us writing in our own language and in English. We cannot write like the English. We should not. We cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. Time alone will justify. Unquote. He further says, the tempo of Indian life must be infused into our English expression, even as the tempo of American or Irish life has gone into the making of theirs. We in India think quickly, we talk quickly, and we move quickly. There must be something in the sun of India that makes a rush and tumble and run on, and our paths interminable. So when we are, unquote, when we are talking about formulating an Indian approach to comparative world literature, possibly Raja Rao's pointers in the forward to his Kantapura could could be highly enlightening for us. So therefore, the use of English as a narrative language, fashioned in accordance with the folk idioms and oral culture that we see happening in Kantapura and also in R.K. Narayan, the oral cultures of storytelling in India facilitated what could be termed as a multimedial experience involving the simultaneous use of multiple modes of traditional of experience. So translation, therefore, could be seen here more as a conceptual framework or mechanism closely aligned with what my teacher, Professor T.S. Satyanath, refers to as social epistemology. But through these perspectives, as noted by Satyanath, the entire history of Indian literatures could be perceived as a highly complex construction involving a series of complex literary, ritualistic, and artistic interrelationships that involve exchanges at multiple levels, unquote. But these networks of complex exchange and multimedial negotiations could be located even in the late 20th and early 21st century works of Salman Rushdie and Amitabh Ghosh as well. So English here becomes the medium of constructing an Indian experience of reality perceived at multiple levels of expression: textual, oral performative, ritual, cultural, and also deeply political, historical. We know, particularly when reading Rushdie, we come across these factors. All these experientialities deeply rooted within the Indian consciousness are translated upon through and into the common linguistic medium of English. Therefore, the very act of writing in English, writing in or in translating into English in India becomes a way of not only facilitating interlingual transfer of meanings between the Indian languages, but also enabling a unifying Indian experience, bringing together elements from the literary as well as non-literary domains of its society. So therefore, we need to recognize the vernacular traces of English, which will possibly enable us to move towards a more inclusive vision of cosmopolitanism. So then again, we have further instances with Anandamath, how the different translations of Anandamath dealt with different perspectives of Indianness. And also Tagore's Gitanjali, how multiple translations was, and also uh, the one done by William Radice, who recently passed away in 2011, was motivated by an ethical responsibility felt by the said translator towards restoring to Tagore the real Gitanjali, a poetic endeavor that he cared about deeply, but with Yeats's editing. Let's pay attention to this. Yeats's editing, the Nobel Prize, the numerous secondary translations, and the canonical status that it acquired, rather took out of his hands, unquote. It may seem, therefore, that the translator here wished to recreate the originary moment of the poem's existence as it moved right from Tagore's creative philosophical imagination. So this could therefore be also seen as an attempt on the part of the translator to provide an unmediated experience of the real through the act of translation, an objective rendered more complex in this regard, since there are already a translated version of the poems brought out by the poet himself in the first place. So here we are dealing with multiple translation. So here I am concluding. So we have therefore seen how specific works by certain authors have acquired a greater visibility outside the confines of the source language, by the very fact of being translated into English. In this way, translation becomes a kind of a linguistic passport for such authors and their works to move beyond the points of their origins and acquire worldwide attention and acclaim. And here, as I have discovered through my researches on medieval writings, say example writings on the translations of the Ramayana. For example, in the present context, the Tulsi Ramayana is more popular than the Madhavpanditi Ramayana, but Madhavpanditi Ramayana was the first Ramayana to have been composed in a North Indian language. But if you look at the present translation scenario, there are issues of circulation beyond the point of origin, which has determined which particular work gets more popularity vis-a-vis other works. However, even though the translation into English is often seen as an emancipatory act or even a sacred duty towards globalizing the hitherto unappreciated literary excellence of an author in the vernacular, there's, however, nothing more important than ensuring an accurate and not necessarily faithful, yet a thoroughly readable translation on the part of the translator. Such an act, however, is easier said than done, and hence translation forever remains in a state of becoming. Every translation fulfills one objective at the expense of the other. It's a never-ending endeavor, and therein lies the beauty and allure of it. So if I come back to the point I began, so the sense of becoming, the sense of ever existing, evolving, is an approach that we must take into consideration even while talking about literary history. It's not something closed or being closed. This is something that is constantly evolving, and like in translation, even in conceptualizing literary history or conceptualizing works of comparing different works of literature, we need to understand how works have grown within literary cultures. How? Because a work, the moment it is written, it's not inhabiting a static atmosphere. It's not inhabiting within a static ambience. The reception to the work continually evolves over a period of time. Even while undertaking works of comparison, we need to take into account the multimedial engagements of the work, not only with the written culture, but also the oral and the performative culture, which forms the universe within which that particular work is located. We take any, whether we take Anandamath, or when, if I talked about the works of Indira Goswami, right? The novels of Indira Goswami are not just isolated works of literature written in Assamese. Even within Assamese, there are, certain films have been made, right, of those works. So there could be more intensified multimedia engagement between different manifestation representations of those works within a larger literary cultural universe. That's how we can take a relook at the way works within Assam, Northeast India, or the Indian literary culture in general could be seen. And comparative world literature, as I said at the very beginning, has an important role to play in fulfilling the objectives that we have set right in front of us. So I end here. These are my references. So thank you so much for your listening, and I thank again Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am. and Paramita Das and the entire fraternity of Hindi University West Bengal for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an illuminating and speech, such an wonderful presentation. And now I would request Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am for her very significant remarks.
Well, Dr. Dhurjjati, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so as expected, it was a very thorough research, and your PowerPoint, lot of text. So I would request you to share it with us. We can
Sure, ma'am.
circulate it among our faculty and students, and whenever they want to quote, they will certainly give you the academic credit. And this particular lecture, YouTube number, they will quote. Well, in your lecture, even if it was on Northeastern literature, but you substantially gave importance to many other Indian languages and literatures, and also world literatures. And you talked about Bangla, Persian, and Sanskrit literatures at large. And I think this kind of comparative discourses should emerge out of these kind of seminars and lectures. And then translation as a linguistic passport, certainly, and then translation of the many Ramayans that you pointed out. I think people should take up more projects and researches on that, like Madhav Kandale's folk Ramayan, and then
Mm,
Jagamohan Ramayan or the Dandi Ramayan by 15th century Odia poet Balaram Das. There are
mm,
so many Ramayans, but we prioritize one text over the other. When we think about the mainstream Ramayans, we can only talk about Valmiki or Ramcharitmanas, and people forget these very interesting and important texts of our oral studies. And I'm glad that you talked about the appropriated and the unappropriated texts in the regional and the vernacular languages, and the issue of circulation is very, very important.
mm,
If you just Google most circulated texts of the Ramayana, you get only two. You don't get all of them. But it's high
mm,
time that comparatists like you and Shibani and all of us, especially Hindi University, when we are going to introduce a department of comparative world literatures, uh, we need not prioritize one text over the other. Rather, we should give equal, importance and balance all the oral, folk, traditional, contemporary and the classical texts of our Indian literatures. And I'm really happy that you pointed out these things with authentic research, with proper referencing and everything. And your research is going to be useful for our students and faculty. From your lecture, I took a few critical points that I would ask all of us to do some further research, like the Indological bias and the vernacular containment. That is one thing. So Indologists, they frame the vernacular literatures sometimes as static and folkloric. So they claim that if it is uh, oral, it is folklore. Once it is documented, it's written, its folk element is lost. With
correct.
that museumization and romanticization of folklore, we put it at a distance. We museumize folklore, we museumize the oral literatures. We feel so romantic about them, but when there is the question of bringing them to the university tables, to the syllabus, or to the research or books, most of the times we hesitate. And you talked about how Northeastern literary texts are reduced to anthropological cursories rather
Mm,
than
yes.
the mainstream texts. And the dynamic world literature that Northeastern literature is or capable of, or the philosophical and the aesthetic complexities of Northeastern literature thereof, these things are ignored. And you pointed out those things, and you tried to bridge the barriers between the English and other literatures. Like you dislocated, I mean, people, they dislocate the indigenous linguistics epistemics through importance of only English in Indian scenario. Uh, you questioned canon formation. How canon formation and the oral written divide has become a huge challenge in syllabus design committees. Being a part of syllabus divide, preparation committees in many universities in India, I have been a part of almost 40 to 50 syllabus design committees. Every time, I am the only unconventional person coming up with vernacular texts. Let me use the word vernacular, though we should not.
Mm,
I come up with those ideas, bhasha literatures, oral texts, and
mm.
folk texts. But again, everybody questions me about a canon. And in your lecture, you questioned that kind of canon formation and the oral written divide. When I remember in 2008, when seven in fact, when the whole world was only talk in English departments, the whole world was teaching only British and American literature or a bit of Canadian and Australian studies. I had the audacity of proposing a PG diploma in folk literature in the year 2007. And in the year 2008, I offered PG diploma in folklore and culture studies with 5 books, MFC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The books are already there in the e-Gyan course, and 14,000 students took that program in the first year. So it was like people were hungry, people were curious to go for our, bhasha literatures and oral literatures, but we were not giving those to them. We started with that, and to my happiness and to my good fortune, I was instrumental in designing many northeastern literature courses for my university. And even here I'm introducing one MA in Assamese, or maybe today I was thinking it should not be MA in Assamese but MA in northeastern literature, so that we can take all the 7 states like Shivani has categorized one from the other.
Correct.
We can think about that,
Mm.
and that is where I will need the help of the two of you and many such scholars like you who are experts of northeastern Indian literature to design that MA program in MA in Northeastern literature. But probably I should do 7 MA courses. So we'll think about that. We will have a brainstorming. One MA program or all 7 states 7 MA program. We have to talk about those. Then also you defended oral literatures from a print-centric historicism, and you demanded a new archival and pedagogical method for the introduction of northeastern literatures in universities. And you were very, very assertive in your lecture. I'm glad you were, because one has to be assertive in certain cases. Because in the year 2010, 2021, during COVID, when I proposed the second year courses of MA in folk literature, converting the diploma of 2007 to MA in 2020-21, that is when Dhurjjati was introduced to me by Professor Satyanath. So even then, I had to go through a lot of struggle. People were not approving an MA in folk literature, and then I had to be very, very assertive. So you have to be
Mm.
assertive at certain points, especially when you are a member of the policy decision committees. So you both are coming up as good scholars in Northeastern literary studies. Maybe you both are established scholars. So whenever you are a part of any syllabus design committee, please ensure that not only a couple of books by say Tamshola, or one or two writers from Northeastern literature only pointed out. In our MA folk literature MFC 008, we have taken many Northeastern literary figures as
Mm.
our part of our text. So try to take the marginal and the mainstream, all the writers of Northeastern literature, rather than taking only one or two. I remember that I got YD Tongsit translated from Assamese to English by a scholar, and then I
Mm.
made the scholar do PhD on YD Tongsi, folklore and folk life in YD Tongsi. And then the student had multiple contributions. One contribution to translation studies, the other contribution to folk literature, the other contribution to research and methodology of Northeastern studies, pedagogy of Northeastern. So, one research should have multiple contributions, and that is what you are trying to do. And you concluded your lecture towards the plural and planetary Northeastern literature, the multi-sited, the relational world literatures, and you talked about kinship, folklore, memory, resistance, epistemic erasers, and how to challenge those things. It was a paper of multiple ideas, and I got so many things today. My takeaway is extremely good from the two of you. I'm glad that we invited the two of you. These lectures have only initiated more ideas to me and to my faculty members. When we design our MA in comparative world literatures, we will certainly need help from both of you, and to try to gather some more scholars who can also contribute to the MA programs, because we have to plan the lessons. We will not just put a text and forget about it. Unlike many most conventional universities, just propose a syllabus, one half a page syllabus on the website, and it's done. We will not do like that, because I am from IGNO and IGNO has trained me. For me, one chapter is nothing less than 10,000 pages, and Dr. Dhurjjati knows that our MA folk literature is nothing less than 15,000 pages. Of course, this is a conventional university, so I'll not do exactly that. But whenever we introduce any chapter, say Madhav Kandale's Folk Ramayan, suppose this is one of the texts, the syllabus will have a detailed review. What are the things to be studied from that text? What are the questions? What are the critical points to be taken from that, and how to plan the lesson and how to prepare for the exam? We will plan our chapters like that. So with this, I stop here and I pass it on to Paramita. If there are questions you take, or if there are many questions, you email them. But again, many thanks to both of you for having accepted our invitation, and congratulations for
Most welcome.
these two
Thank you.
important
Thank
lectures.
you.
We have, yeah,
Thank
we have
you.
recorded both the lectures for the benefit of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for
Thank
your
you
input.
very much. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. And actually, at the beginning of this webinar, we got some raised hands. So I request our participants, if you have any questions, please ask.
Yeah, I think they had questions for Shivani. I saw that. But if now they have logged out, then it's okay. Take their questions later. Just check.
So, okay, ma'am. So for the participants, I would like to say that please don't worry. We have shared our mail address in the chat box, and you can send your questions to us, and we would love to send it to our speakers. Thank you. And as now we have come to the end of our webinar today. So before we go, I would like to thank Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, our esteemed and prominent speakers, Dr. Shibani Phukan and Dr. Dhurjjati Sharma, and a very special thanks to the team of Hindi University. And last but not the least, our lovely participants for joining us today. Thank you and have a very good day. Namaste.
Thank you,
And thanks to
Paramita. You
you,
you
Dr.
are doing a
Das,
good job. Yeah, they want
for
to say something.
coordinating the whole thing. Thanks to Dr. Paramita for
Yes, she's been very
coordinating
good.
the whole event. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Yes, she made the whole thing very, very smooth, Paramita. So
yes,
excellent coordination.
yes.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Nandini ma'am. Thank you very,
Thank
very
you,
much for
Nandini
this.
ma'am, also, I mean, most importantly, for your initiative, which has made everything possible in the first place. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Nandini ma'am.
Thanks. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.